My guest today is Kurt Piehler, and this week we're going to talk about perhaps one of the most famous battles in the entire World War II and a change of tide on the Allied side of the war, which is, of course, D-Day and the landing on Normandy and Omaha Beach. So, of course, as always, you have written a book that we're going to begin with this discussing on this topic, but I want to say, what was it about D-Day and the liberation of France that got you so fascinated about this part of World War II?
Yeah, I mean, I think D-Day um, has emerged, I think, not only in the United States, but I think particularly in Western Europe, and I would say in Europe in general, as one of the defining moments of World War II. It was the long-awaited Second Front that Stalin and the Soviet Union was pressing the Western Allies to open. It's a success. It's a success with a great cost. It does bring the British and American armies, the bulk of the British and American armies finally confront the bulk of the German armies in Western Europe. Now, one of the important things always about D-Day, I think that gets in our remembering D-Day, we must not forget that neither the British or the Americans or the Canadians, the three biggest land forces in Western Europe, never confronted the bulk of the German army. That the bulk of the German army after June 22nd, 1941, until the war ends on May 8th, is confronted by the Soviet Union. So D-Day is, I think, in part possible because of Soviet first being able to stop the German offensive and then later to push it back. And in fact, the Soviets, as D-Day is being launched, launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front, which helps to pin down the German forces.
And we're going to discuss this a little bit closer to the ending, of course, but I want to ask you, what is it arrogance from de Gaulle when Paris was liberated, that he did quote this of Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated by itself, liberated by its people with the help of the French armies, and doesn't acknowledge the Allied help.
Yeah, I mean, I think France is it's such a complex role in World War II because it is along with Britain, it basically draws the line in Poland finally. It goes to war in alliance with Britain. It is one of the few countries to surrender. I mean, most countries, such as Norway, such as the Netherlands, such as Greece, the government goes into exile. And continues the struggle. In the case of Norway, the Norwegian Navy and the Norwegian merchant marine played a pivotal role. But France actually surrenders. It is then liberated, and then it is welcomed back into the Western Alliance. But there's an enormous amounts of collaboration of the highest order in France. You have a government that surrenders. And essentially allies itself with Germany, and I think de Gaulle, who is the dissident, who is fighting, he's basically a rebel. He's in rebellion against the established French government. Does get support first from Churchill and then grudgingly from Roosevelt. How do you rehabilitate a defeated nation that had collaborated in the highest order? And I think the liberation of Paris is just. I mean, the French people did uprise in Paris against their German occupiers, but I also think it was an important symbol for de Gaulle to show that France had returned to the ranks of first-rate nations. But I mean, one of the things that divides French society, basically to this day, was grappling with defeat and collaboration, and the way to deal with that, I think, for de Gaulle. And many of his supporters was, let's emphasize resistance and let's talk a little bit about collaboration, but let's not dwell on it.
Now, let's talk a little bit before we go into D-Day itself. Let's begin with Nazi-occupied France, and talk a little bit about life there, because couldn't be quite brutal for the French people. And as some historians have stated, that there was shortage of food in Paris, especially. Food was power. It was not money. It was food that was power. But let's talk a little bit about Nazi.
Yeah, I mean, France is sort of initially divided into occupied France and unoccupied France, and the French government moves to the resort town of Vichy Um, and I mean, one of the things to say, I mean, the groups that were in the outs with the Germans, particularly the Jews, were rounded up, and many started getting deported to concentration camps and death camps. Um, Socialists don't fare well, dissidents don't fare well. In both occupied France and in unoccupied France. The Germans basically expropriate as much as they can from France. France, particularly in terms of food, is forced to export. You know, basically, that doesn't quite starve itself. I mean, the French do better than, for example, the Poles, but it's still a pretty brutal system in terms of particularly shortages of food and fuel, but also clothing. Much more limited transportation is available. And the Germans are the occupiers, particularly in northern France. Um, after the British and American invasion of French North Africa in 1942, the first major D-Day in Europe by the Western Allies, Germans occupy all of France, and unoccupied France no longer exists after December of 1942.
Why did not Hitler choose to use the French army in his Wehrmacht? Because it doesn't use, it's my understanding that it doesn't incorporate the French army into the Wehrmacht.
He doesn't incorporate the French army, but it's limited within unoccupied French. And there are French volunteers that are recruited by the SS. And so there are French speaking units. Also, those in Alsace and Lorraine are now deemed once again German citizens. And so they are forced to serve in the German army. While he doesn't incorporate the French army, he does incorporate Frenchmen into the German army, either as part of now citizens of the Reich or in terms of volunteers. And Hitler drew. It is striking. He drew from many of occupied countries do provide volunteers to his armies. Even Britain had a very, very small contingent of British who were fighting for the Germans. The only country that I found no evidence of any collaboration like that was the United States. American POWs did not turn and fight for the Germans.
So let's talk about the little recap of the war from Dunkirk until the Operation Overlord before we go into, because I feel like we should do I did cover World War II last summer, but let's do a little bit recap because I feel like it's necessary to understand.
I think the war has some in Europe has several distinct stages. I mean, the war begins in September of 1939 with the invasion of Poland, and France and Britain enter the war. And initially it's called the phony war because very little happens. And for example, the British are very reluctant, despite building up air power, to use it against Germany for fear of retaliation. The British, I think, are fairly confident that, for example, economic warfare will help win victory, like it did in World War I. By the British Navy still rules the seas, and can effectively blockade Germany. And the notion was that the German economy will collapse. It's interesting to read some of the predictions about the collapse of the German economy. One of the things that prevents that one of the things that the crucial ingredient that allows Hitler to turn both against Poland, but then later turn west, was the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in August of 1939. And that I don't think we give enough credit to that non-aggression pact for what it meant. I mean, one thing in the case of the United States, it did disillusion some communists. I mean, some communists leave the party over that, or become much more lukewarm. And many liberals and socialists who had sort of, they didn't necessarily fully embrace the Soviet experiment, but they were kind of curious about it. They were willing to give it a chance. Like the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. I mean, he becomes very, very critical. He is much more skeptical of the Soviet Union because of the non-aggression pact. it was also a foolish thing for Stalin to do. Ultimately, Hitler's realpolitik was canceled out by Hitler's racism and his desire. I mean, he views the Slavs as an inferior race. And of course, one of the key events on the Western Front or in the war in Europe is the invasion of France and its collapse after 6 weeks, which is shocking to people because until World War II, until the collapse of France was viewed as having the best army in Europe. It had prevailed in World War One. It had a very good tank. It had more tanks than the German army, but it suffers. I think most importantly, it suffers from bad leadership and some really foolish decisions in retrospect. The French were aware that the Maginot Line, this defensive fortifications, did not extend up to the Belgian cut through Belgium. But they very quickly moved into Belgium. There was a plan to move into Belgium to meet German forces. But one of the things that they failed to do, and it is one of the ironies of World War II, is the failure by the Western Allies to defend the Ardennes. It's not defended in 1940, and it was ill defended in 1944, which leads to the Battle of the Bulge. But the fall of France, I mean, it leaves Great Britain and the British Empire alone. And Britain will fight alone for 1 year. It will prevail, partly because it has the Royal Navy and partly because of the Royal Air Force. World War II, I'm not going to talk a lot about the war in the Pacific because that's, I think, a whole nother podcast.
Yeah.
But I've always been struck by Franklin Roosevelt and his role in World War II, because I think Roosevelt opposes the Nazis. One, I think he thinks they're a threat to national security, even in the Western Hemisphere. But I also think he opposed them on ideological grounds, and one of them was religion. Roosevelt believes that a good liberal society, that religion is an important value, and also he believes in religious pluralism and tolerance. And he speaks, for example, he gives an address in 1936 for the National Council of Christians and Jews, and radio address nationally in the United States. And he basically says, we are enriched as a country by religious diversity. And that it's important to respect this diversity because each group gives us something really valuable. And it is a consistent theme throughout his presidency. I mean, in 1944, he will provide a statement to a conference against anti-Semitism, and he says, Hitler used attacks on the Jews to whip up the German people, and he is used, and anti-Semitism is being used to support Hitler's game. And no good American should embrace anti-Semitism. You're playing Hitler's game. I mean, just before America enters the war, he gives a radio address, and he says, the Nazis are out to destroy all religion, which was actually true.
I mean, Nazis and religion is a whole, like you say, it's a whole other podcast as well.
But so we do I mean, in a country, the United States is very reluctant to enter another European war. We've been very disillusioned by World War I. It is remarkable what he does to bring the country to war. One, after the fall of France, he mobilizes the U.S. National Guard, part-time citizen soldiers, the reserve forces. He supports, at first grudgingly, but then wholeheartedly supports a peacetime draft. You have a massive rearmament. So the United States, if the United States had to enter World War II in September of 1939, it would have been lucky to field 2 divisions. It was a force of an army of about 250,000. By Pearl Harbor, it's an army of 3 million. I mean, we have a massive buildup and a massive naval buildup. We are also, besides sending enormous supplies to Britain and then later the Soviet Union, by the fall of 1941, we're engaged in undeclared naval war with Germany. The paradox is that we're also concerned about Japanese expansion, but Roosevelt is indecisive on policy towards Japan. He allows second-tier figures to run that policy, where he is his chief diplomat in dealing with Germany and dealing with Britain and trying to form an alliance essentially against the Nazis, where he lets second-tier figures deal with Japan. We don't appreciate Japanese and military power. We think we can use economic pressure to pressure Japan to stop its aggression, what we view its aggression. Ultimately, Japan goes to war, and because they're in alliance with Germany, Germany makes it very easy for Roosevelt, in a sense, to declare war against the United States, and so ends political debate in the United States. The Pearl Harbor and the German declaration of war against the United States ends what would have been fairly fierce debate over whether the United States should enter that war. And in many ways, the two turning points for the war, why ultimately the Nazis will be defeated, is one, when they stupidly invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941, and when they declare war on the United States, because you have the formation of what becomes the Grand Alliance pretty quickly. Under the
it is my understanding, and we discussed this in our episode on Barbarossa as well with David Stahl, is that one of the reasons they attacked the Soviet Union is because they had tortoises, which were, again, you had oil, and Hitler needed oil to win the war. So that was one reason.
But the Soviets were very good about sending oil to the Germans. They were honoring the non-aggression pact, and they were sending literally the evening before the attack, the evening of the attack. Their shipments are still going into Germany, fuel and other raw materials. The Soviets do get military technology from the Germans, but the formation of the Grand Alliance and creating a broader alliance, fighting under the United Nations. Ultimately, Roosevelt is able to bring much of Latin America into the war. In fact, by the end of the war, there are only a handful of neutral countries in the world that are not in the war. It's you can count them on two hands, the number of neutral countries out in the Ireland is one of them, Sweden is another, but the world gets pretty divided between Axis and
Spain, I think, is
Spain
as well.
Portugal.
Turkey joined the last 5 months into the war.
I mean, we even basically make Argentina declare war against Germany, and eventually Turkey even declares war. One of the things that divides the Grand Alliance is the desire for the Second Front, because it's not until Stalingrad, the victory in Stalingrad in January of 1943, it's not until the victory in El Alamein in late 1942, is it clear that it's not certain the Allies will win. I mean, there were 3 turning point battles. In the Pacific, it was Midway. In the Eastern Front, it was
Stalingrad,
and to a certain and Kursk, the battles of Kursk, and which decisively turned back the German offensive, these last of the offensives, and El Alamein that prevents the Suez from falling and Cairo from falling and turns back Rommel's advance. And so this turning point, you have Stalin is pressing as soon as the United States enters the war, he is pressing the British and the Americans to open a second front. Roosevelt and his Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, would have ideally liked to open one in 1942 in France. The problem is the British have no enthusiasm for that. Ultimately, Roosevelt decides, almost as a compromise, but eager to get American forces, land forces, engaged with the German army. We initially invade. Our first D-Day is against French forces in North Africa. Our second D-Day is once we secure North Africa from Vichy, but then from German forces, we then turn to Sicily and ultimately Italy. Those are the other D-Days, the D-Days on Sicily, the D-Days at Salerno, the D-Days at Anzio, and then there's the D-Day, which I think now the term D-Day was widely used in World War II, but the D-Day we remember is the D-Day on June 6, 1944.
Let's begin with the planning of what they called then, I believe, Operation Overlord, as the Allied invasion of mainland Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first success about D-Day, it even goes beyond the planning. It is how we structure the Western Alliance. Um, um, the British, which viewed themselves, British generals and politicians, political leaders viewed them much smarter as the Americans. But the Americans now had the bigger economy, even with the Empire and Commonwealth. They had more troops. They were developing a larger army, um, and the British had a secede dominant leadership. While British commanders, for example, the Italian theater becomes under a supreme commander is British. Um, the invasion of the D-Day operation, the Operation Overlord, and the land campaign in Western Europe is going to be led by an American. The British will have to concede that point. George Marshall, who was Army Chief of Staff, wanted to be that supreme commander of the Allied forces. Uh, Ultimately, Roosevelt vetoes that. He thinks he's too important and must stay behind in Washington. And so Dwight Eisenhower is deputized to be the Supreme Allied Commander, who had cut his teeth as a commander in North Africa and Sicily, and then is named as Supreme Allied Commander. And Eisenhower is an interesting choice because in 1939, he is a colonel.
His name is not that well known at the time,
He's
right?
not
It's
that
only
well
after
known.
D-Day.
Yeah, he had been in the army in World War I. He never made it to France. He thought his career was going to be basically not going to advance very far. He's a staff officer now, a very good staff officer. He had served with MacArthur, for example, in the early 30s, both in the United States when MacArthur was Army Chief of Staff, later in the Philippines. He had also had gotten to know World War I battles very well because he spent part of his career during the early 1930s is writing the official guide to American battlefields in Europe. So he was actually a pretty good historian. He had actually done some real historical research for these guidebooks. He had lived in Europe as a result of working in these guidebooks. He lived in Paris. He and his family had a grand time in interwar years, being stationed in Paris. Ike had never seen combat. He had never led men in combat. But I think one of Ike's great strengths is he recognized how important it was to build an effective working alliance and to build a command structure it's a hard thing to integrate. It's actually even hard to integrate. And I mean, he also has to integrate naval officers and Army Air Force officers in a command structure, and the British. And he builds a very effective command structure. And I think that's one of the successes. And people forget. And he had some real egos among his commanders. The egos of Omar Bradley. And George Patton on the American general side, and also the ego of Bernard Montgomery. But some of the divisions, there is a real British and American division, but some of the divisions is between the SHAEF senior leadership and his field generals. His number 2 is an Air Force Marshal. The commanders of Air Force, Allied Expeditionary Air Forces was a British commander. And the naval forces were led by a British commander. So while Ike was the senior commander, all the other subordinate commands and the commands from Army, Navy, and Air were British commanders. And creating an effective integrated command was vital for success, and it also would also be a model for NATO, which NATO operates with on its command system with an integrated command that's composed of officers from different armies. And so that's one of the key successes. The other this decision was made, partly there was some experiments done, and one was a bloody experiment. There was a raid launched against the French port of Dieppe by largely Canadian troops, but some British troops, and also a handful of American Rangers, and it's a fiasco. It's costly. But one of the lessons that learned is let's think hard about attacking a fortified harbor. Because the logical place to attack, the closest point to Britain and between Britain and France was Calais. And the Germans is one of the most heavily defended parts of France in terms of the German efforts to defend against an Western Allied invasion. The planning for D-Day is actually begun by a British general even before Ike arrives, and the planning takes a good year, and the preparations take a good year. It's only in late 1943, early 1942 do we really, not only does the planning pick up stride, but also the preparations pick up stride. One of the key things that delays D-Day, and it's the great excuse that the Churchill keeps using, is the lack of a landing craft and the need for landing craft. The other thing I think that makes D-Day successful, and it's another one of the ironies of war, is how to win the war. I mean, I think the British thought the blockade would work again. The American Air Force, but also the British Air Force, the Royal Air Force, thought we can bomb the Germans into submission. And Air Force doctrine, both British and American, think our bombing campaign will bring victory. And in the case of, in 1943, the Army Air Force is trying to knock out with daylight bombing ball bearing plants and other crucial factories. I think this will lead to the collapse of the German war effort. And it doesn't. In fact, German production peaks in 1944. But one of the things the air war does do, it ultimately defeats the German Air Force, because we need to defeat
if I may, it's do try to avoid bombing industrial areas. That I do bomb them, but I do believe that it try to avoid bombing industrial areas, right? Because they don't believe that they can pick up when they invade, that they can use the industrial areas themselves.
One of the things we're trying to do in the Air Force is trying to, in 43, they're trying to bomb industrial areas. One of the big fights Ike has, and as I said, it's not just between allies, but between forces, is the American air commanders, but also the British air commanders, don't want to turn over air assets to him. And at one point, it was the only time he threatened to resign. He wrote Marshall and said, if I do not get complete control on the eve of the invasion over air power, over the air forces, I'm going to resign, because I need, because the Air Force hated the idea of having to bomb bridges and railway lines leading into Normandy. They thought the way to win this war was to bomb factories, or Arthur Harris thought the way to win this war is to dehouse the German population, to break the civilian morale. And the jury's still out of how effective air power was in terms of economically forcing the Germans, speeding German surrender. What's very clear is for us to continue this air campaign, we had to take on the German Air Force. And so by D-Day, we have won the battle of attrition with the German Air Force. We have control of the skies, and that's crucial. Also, Ike wins the bureaucratic battle. And in the spring of 1944, he has control over a lot of the air assets he needs. And so there's a very successful interdiction campaign to bomb bridges, and particularly bridges and railway lines into Normandy to try to cut off the peninsula as best as possible. One of the things that should really be remembered about World War II is the enormous cost to civilians. Even civilians were not trying to kill. Like, Bomber Harris had no compulsion about killing German civilians in his campaign of area bombing. But we really did not, for example, want to kill French civilians. But ultimately, the battle for France, air casualties from bombing leads to 100,000 French civilians dying in this war. And air power in World War, air power is still an imprecise weapon, even with our technology. Witness the Gaza campaign, but it was incredibly imprecise. And when you think of 100,000 French dying from the air campaign, when we are trying not to kill, the Western allies are trying not to kill, we take a lot more precautions in bombing France in the war against Germany.
Let's begin talking about the crafts that they use and the famous ships that troops are using build those as well for as you see
Yeah,
when they
I
come into
mean,
the
the
beach.
late Steve Ambrose used to love talking about the Higgins boats, which were designed by this sort of entrepreneur who thought against the grain. That the essential thing about a landing craft was that it was the ramp that could come down and let troops walk off of it. And they build a whole host of variations. They build uh, landing craft that are more heavily armored. But the basic thing is, until World War II, you did not have a craft that could essentially get troops all the way up to a beach that had a shallow enough draft that you could that ideally drop them that they barely got their feet wet. I mean, um, one of the tragedies, particularly on Omaha Beach, is that a lot of troops and a lot of land D-days in both Europe, but in the Pacific, that troops are dropped off too quickly.
Mm.
But um, I remember once interviewing a guy who landed troops in Utah. He commanded a landing craft, and it was interesting the perils. He was rather matter of facted because he said, I did several waves, and he said, I think on the first wave, he said both landing crafts next to me blew up. They both were hit, and I was very fortunate. I just went in. Um, the naval part of D-Day does not get as much attention, partly because it's so enormously successful. I also think it definitely does not get enough attention by Americans because it's a British operation. The British and the Canadian navies dominate the Battle of the Atlantic, and the British Navy provides the core navy along with the Canadians. I mean, there's a significant American naval presence, but it's really the world is divided. The Pacific is in some ways an American ocean in World War II, and the Atlantic remains a Canadian and British ocean. Um, and the Germans have practically no naval forces they can throw at the America at the invasion, nor much of an air force to throw at it. And those are key ingredients to success.
Let's talk a little bit about the truth morale because most of them must be aware that they came in, and most of them were. There was 99% chance they would survive. Would not survive this landing on Omaha Beach.
There
So
was
let's
a
talk a
lot
little
of
whether that's rites, whether rituals that they had before going into this, or superstitions that they used before going into Omaha Beach.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wrote a book, A Religious History of the American GI, and it is interesting about what happens. The military the Americans in World War II spent a lot of money on religion. And with the first time we spent large sums of money to provide chaplains, to build military chapels for them to worship at. We never really done that before. We issue free Bibles. We have a Catholic edition, a Protestant edition, and Jewish scriptures that are given to GIs free of charge. And chaplains are warned, don't be holy rollers or don't be super patriots, but they are there to explain why they're fighting and why this war is important. And many of them stay very close to their men. I mean, one of the most remarkable chaplains I encountered was this Catholic priest, Francis Sampson, Father Sampson. He's an army chaplain. He's with the paratroopers, and he jumps on D-Day. And he
Wow.
actually, at one point, he and a group of men are actually taken prisoner. And Sampson says to the men, "Why don't you start praying? This will calm you down because they're captured, but there's all this fighting going around them." Um, and then they start praying the Lord's Prayer, and then the two groups of GI start arguing because the Catholics say this is the way you say the Lord's Prayer, and the Protestants disagreed with them. And he said, "Knock it off. Say the prayer you know, the way you were taught." And he thought this. He said, I thought this was just crazy, given how dire our situation was. But I almost became hysterical because the
It's
idea
almost comedic in a sense.
they're arguing over whether to say at the end, "For thine is the power and the glory," because in the Catholic tradition you don't say those lines. Um, prayer. It's interesting about. I mean, many GIs will also on a D-Day or before D-Day, they can often be quite pragmatic on where they take comfort in. So um, it was a D-Day in the Pacific, but I remember this one Jewish chaplain. He was the only chaplain on board the ship, And so he had to lead all three services. And so he first led the Catholic service. He couldn't say mass, but he had one of the Catholic boys say the rosary. They sang some hymns. He read some Catholic oriented scriptures. He then led the Protestant service, which many Jewish rabbis were very comfortable leading the general Protestant service. And then he led Jewish services for the Jewish soldiers. And he said many GIs stayed for all three services. It was not uncommon, say, for Jews to take Holy Communion from a Catholic priest, because everyone in the unit was doing that. So there's a lot of sort of pluralism and
I mean,
ecumenicalism.
if I may draw a parallel, because as you see in the TV show MASH, which is just offline, you see the chaplain there, Father Murtayu. He does all three services as well. So that must have been pretty common both in World War II as well and under the Korean War, where the chaplain did all three services.
Yeah, they're not supposed to. For example, they're definitely told not to. Protestant and Jewish ministers are told not to say mass, but they often do ad hoc services for Catholic GIs, and it's a very interesting dynamic. So a lot. I mean, faith is comforts a lot of men, but I always think it's important. There are atheists in foxholes, and so for some men, they are agnostic. They are atheists. This is not where they find their comfort, and I think that religious pluralism and diversity that exists is really important. It is interesting. One of the things I interviewed this guy, Ben Franklin, who had D-Day was his third landing. He had landed in North Africa. He had landed in Sicily. And I asked him, he landed on Omaha Beach with the 1st Division. And he said, I asked him, what was the most frightening, what was the one single frightening incident in the war that you experienced? And it wasn't D-Day. He said once he was stuck out in the desert, in the desert in North Africa, and a German plane, basically, as he remembered, it might have been shorter amount of time, strafed him what he recalled for an hour, trying to kill him. And that says a lot, that D-Day, because Omaha, he did not mince words about how brutal Omaha Beach was. But it always irked him that, he landed with the 1st Division, and they were really battle hardened. The veterans of that division, they had been fighting since December of 1942. And it really irked him that the Rangers, who had been untested in battle, and along with the airborne units, were considered elite units, when he, the first, was very battle tested. But they were sort of given the feeling was the air assault. There was a lot more optimism that the air power and naval assault would be much more successful, and that was one of the great failures, was the bombing of the landing sites. Now it was very successful, paradoxically, on Utah, where it was needed less. Medium bombers were used, and they actually did successfully hit a number of targets. But long-range heavy bombers were used against Omaha, and you can see the craters still to this day, and they hit nowhere near where they needed to hit, and killed a lot of cows, and even killed some Frenchmen, but not, so the naval bombardment wasn't long enough, and that was one of the disputes, and the air bombardment, particularly of Omaha, was a failure. And so many, particularly untested troops from untested divisions, faced much worse circumstances than they expected. So a lot of them did not expect. The devastation that would occur in Omaha was not what they were told to expect.
So I want to talk a little bit about, because Hitler, it is my understanding, he knew that the D-Day was coming. The man in Omaha, as far as I know, is that the kind of misconception? Was he really aware?
They were aware that an operation was coming, but they expected Calais was going to be the target. One of the things we do very effectively to keep them thinking that is we bombed Calais very heavily for weeks, and even when even on June, the days around before D-Day and even after D-Day, we continue to bomb Calais. And so Calais is where we speak. It took them actually several days to realize Normandy, the landing at Normandy. This was the real invasion. This is not a diversion attack. no, the invasion is not coming to Calais. It is coming. It is coming. This is it, Normandy. And so um, that was I think in terms of planning this, the selection of Normandy and keeping up the ruse that Calais was the target. One of the we have the British have very effective counterintelligence. They turn the German agents in England against them. We've very successfully convinced the Germans that Patton is going to lead this phantom army and Pat, it drives him crazy that he's not going to land on D-Day, and has said, commanding a phantom army in Eastern England, and putting up a great show, reluctantly, that he's commanding this army that will lead. It's hinted will invade invade Calais.
So let's talk about numbers on the Omaha and Normandy that the Wehrmacht had placed it since they thought it was in Calais. So let's talk about numbers that they actually had there to understand the
Yeah, I
battle
mean,
itself.
one of the things, there was recently an article that said, 175,000 Allied troops land, and I actually, I actually need to, I have to dig it out, because it's often not emphasized how many Germans are actually, the actual numbers of Germans troops total, and that gets very nebulous to define defenders and where exactly defenders are. The Germans had moved several better units into the Normandy Peninsula, and it's one of the things we don't fully realize, particularly at Omaha, that the Germans actually had sent some reinforcements into Germany, into the Normandy Peninsula. The other thing but the crucial decision Hitler makes that works very much to the Allied advantages. German panzer units are held in reserve until very late in the day on June 6, 1944. And they don't, I mean, Rommel's notion is the Battle of France and Germany is going to be lost on the day of the Allied landing. And it was absolutely vital to drive the Allies into the sea, which I think Rommel was a realist and knew that was going to be very difficult. But if there was going to be any chance of that, it had to take place on the day of the landing. But German tanks, enter the fray too late, and they're effectively repelled. I mean, there were a number of failures on D-Day. Omaha was much more costly than it should have been. The British didn't make it. They were supposed to seize Caen on the first day. I've always been struck how close they got, because I spent some time in the Caen area on a study tour on D-Day, and I was struck like how far the Canadians got, because they are basically they're almost there. With a few things differently, I think that the British and the Canadians could have been successful with Caen. I mean, but that failure to take it on Caen, it turns into a bruising slugfest after D-Day.
If I may draw another parallel, was the worry that it would be kind of like Axel Ridge, that there would be a stalemate, that it would that there would be just one step forward, two step back kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think what does go very successfully for the Allies is they're not driven into the sea. They have control of air power, naval bombardment, one of the most potent artillery forces for the first few weeks of the campaign is naval fire from British and British and American battleships. That the Germans, do not have that kind of firepower. And the Americans and the British and the Canadians are able to consolidate their beaches and form a unified, what were separate beaches, are linked up. The two problems is for the British, it's Caen, it's breaking Caen, which they ultimately absolutely devastates the city and kills large numbers of civilians. And for the Americans, it's the hedgerows, which they had not really thought out how to break through in the hedgerows. And ultimately, one of the ways they break the hedgerows or try to get a breakthrough is massive firepower, using air power in St. Lo, which leads to one of the worst friendly fire incidents for American forces. It even kills a senior American general sent there to observe, General McNair. But D-Day is the beginning. It is the crucial second front is secured. And while it takes several weeks to break out of the Normandy Peninsula, once British and American forces break out of Normandy, makes the liberation of France possible, along with the second D-Day of against France. The less remembered landing that took place several weeks later in southern France. Now, originally, the Allies had hoped to have simultaneous D-Days against northern France and southern France, but the southern invasion had to be delayed. But the southern invasion faced far less resistance on the beaches, and German forces collapsed much more quickly in the south. But already they'd been ground down. There's a historian I've met. He plans to write a history of D-Day and the battle for Normandy and France from the German perspective, and really center it on there. Like, let's tell the story, because most stories are told for an obvious reason of the story of American successes and dwells on that. But I always thought it was a very intriguing idea.
I do believe there's a similar book on the German perspective from Dunkirk. There is one on Dunkirk from the German perspective.
Yeah.
It's reading here as well. But I want to ask, because as you know, this is the liberation of France. Obviously, there will be some French soldiers as well participating. So do we know the number of French soldiers participating here as well?
I don't know the exact number. It's a relatively small contingent. I think my understanding it's I think a division strength that land. I mean, there are French soldiers that participate in D-Day, and there is a rebuilding as de Gaulle's forces move through France. There is a rebuilding of the French army, and one of the things I don't think gets enough attention in our understanding of who fights in World War II is the important role of the colonies, of colonial troops. That the British would not have won at Al Alamein without the Indian Army, with troops from the Indian Army. A significant number of their forces in Italy are from India. The Gurkhas fight very bravely in the Italian campaign. French colonial troops will fight in the battle for France. And I think it's been one of my disappointments in visiting a lot of World War II museums in France. And even the Imperial War Museum is doing a little bit better job in London, but not enough attention to the important role of colonial troops that fight. Britain would not have prevailed without the Empire and without what were then the Dominions, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and I don't think they get enough due. There's at least on the part of Americans, but I even think on the part of British and French consciousness, the role, how vital colonial troops were.
So let's talk about the landing itself and the battle on Omaha Beach and the liberation of Omaha and Normandy on the day itself and the action that took place, because it must have been traumatizing to at least one of the first boats that landed.
Yeah, I mean, one should say Omaha gets a lot of attention because it went terribly wrong in Omaha. Successive ways were decimated. Omar Bradley thinks he's going to have to pull out of Omaha, and it was really partly as Stephen Ambrose, I think, correctly argues, a lot of GIs, created basically haddock forces on the beach. Units have been devastated to seize key objectives, but also the decision by several destroyer captains to basically risk grounding their destroyers on the beach. They're bringing in their firepower to take out pillboxes, in emplacements. It's only on Omaha that it's really touch and go. I mean, there were significant casualties on the other beaches, but they go much more smoothly. To talk about Utah goes remarkably well. The British, same thing with the British beaches, and the Canadian beaches, Juneau. So there's sort of
not the American state Utah, but Utah in France.
Utah in France, yeah. There's Utah. The British beaches are Sword and Gold. Then there's Juneau, the Canadian beach, and then Omaha and Utah are the American beaches. And there's all the other beaches, and then there's Omaha. And Omaha was just awful. And it's interesting to walk the beaches because, you go to Utah and it's basically flat. There's no place for there are pillboxes there. There are defense emplacements, but there's no high ground really in Utah. Where you go to Omaha, when you walk along the beach and you see what they had to scale And they're, you know, and there's heavy weaponry emplacements and machine guns and stuff. This was really a tough objective. And the same thing, the same thing applies to the other beaches. There's just not the high ground that there is in Normandy. That's a natural defensive barrier that serves the Germans.
Let's talk about the bunkers that the Germans had. How effective were they against the Allied invasion?
They were
Because
incredibly effective, and many of them, if you go to Normandy, you can walk into them, and they're just stunningly well made. You know, the guns have been taken a long time ago, but the rest of it's amazing how well built they were. And particularly when you go to Omaha, how an effective naval and aerial bombardment was, and to see the craters that were left and the misses, a lot of those craters are, you know, still survive from June 6, 1944.
So let's talk about, you know, because one of the things to do imagine is when the boats land on the beach and the doors open and you see soldiers drowning in the water and bullets firing down in the water. How accurate is this depiction that you get from the movies?
Yeah, that depiction is particularly on, I think on Omaha it's pretty accurate. And as I said, the casualty rates are much less on the other beaches, and so these operations on the other beach do lead to casualties, but not like in Omaha. It is very much a bloodbath, and those first waves get absolutely decimated. It's also, you know, and bear in mind that particularly for a number of men, this was their first experience of combat. You know, for veterans of the First Division, they had done this before, but for many men, this was it. Now, I've always been when I interviewed men about and women who've been in combat, it's intriguing reactions to combat, first combat, and there's stories about how they dealt with, but also, you know, fellow soldiers. Some, and particularly some were naive, and so you know, they talk, you know, they would talk about taking risks. They later learned they would never do. You know, and they also talk. I generally, to do an oral history is you interview the successful, those who didn't get killed particularly. But they talked about, you know, men would die sometimes for no good reason because they didn't know what they were doing, and it was interesting to learn, you know, over the years of interviewing World War II veterans. Like, you know, I learned, fortunately, these tips I'll never have to use, but how to survive in combat. I mean, some of the tricks they learned, you know, some of the, you know, some of this, I remember one guy describing, not at D-Day, but later he'd landed on D-Day. He described, like, basically, I forgot, you know, I described how he put these grenades on strings out by his foxhole that they'd be triggered. And it even reflected, he said, 50 years later, said, I don't know if I told the guy who relieved me about these grenades. Like, he could, you know, it was 50 years, he couldn't quite remember, but he's very proud of this thing, this haddock thing he had rigged up. You know, there were physical casualties. There were men who broke down mentally under the stress, and what they found was, if men could get through the first few days of battle or the first week or two, the chances of them having a mental breakdown, mental casualty, go way down until they're much longer in combat. But I think one of the things that boosts morale for British and American forces is if they were wounded and they got medical attention, they were likely to survive. And one can't really understate the value of particularly medics in morale.
Let's talk a little bit about medics on the Omaha. How challenging were the job in?
I mean, it was awful. They're unarmed and they're out to try to save lives. Along with chaplains. I mean, chaplains often, if they're close to the troops, will often aid the medics, and they'll often aid graves registration. So, yeah, it's a really difficult, you know, the medic's job is really quite remarkable, you know, the role. And they're also, in a good way, they're identified with for the most part, the Germans did respect the Red Cross helmet and medics. Generally, both sides didn't fire on medical personnel. But even having said that, to go out into the battle, battle like on Omaha Beach to try to aid the wounded was incredibly perilous.
Were the POWs taken on both sides? What happened if there were POWs that were taken and in the midst of battle?
Oh yeah, I mean, Francis Sampson was taken during prisoner. I don't think exactly on D-Day, but very shortly after D-Day, he manages to escape. Both sides do take prisoners, and for the most part, British and American troops who were captured by the Germans and Canadian troops, the Germans by and large followed the Geneva Convention, and so that meant they went to POW camps. They had access to Red Cross packages. They had access. Red Cross personnel from Switzerland regularly inspected their camps. They were to receive the same. They didn't, but they were supposed to receive the same level of food supplies that a German soldier received. The same rations as a German soldier. It's interesting about American, German, and Italian prisoners of war when they were sent to the United States. Many of them put on weight because they were given the same rations as an American GI. And we were to give you a sense of how well fed the American Army was. The American Army, its goal was, and it largely was successful in making sure that the average American GI had a pound of red meat a day, which I don't know what it would be in the metric, but that's essentially 4 Big Macs a day. That was sort of standard. We're giving the American GI thousands of calories a day, much more than the 2,000 they need to someone not in the military would need. And so British and American, Italian and German POWs, for some this was the best year of their life being an American prisoner of war. I remember I had a friend from college who's here. His uncle was a POW in America. He said it was the best years of his life. He had a grand time, which said something about the rest of his life. But still, he's out of the war and he was well fed and not mistreated. One of the things when I say that the Germans followed the Geneva Convention, one of the things I looked at in my book, A Religious History of the American GI in World War II, was what happened to Jewish POWs. And for the most part, Jewish POWs, particularly if they made it to a POW camp, the Germans, by and large, followed the Geneva Convention. And so most Jewish POWs who fought with the British or Canadian or American armies.
Were they protected by the other soldiers?
They were also protected by the other soldiers, but the Germans actually did follow the Geneva Convention. Now, what does happen to some Jewish GIs is, particularly aviators, is they don't make it to the camp. And one of the understudied things about World War II is the mob attacks against American and British aviators who crash or bail out into Germany. They're often killed by German mobs with the support of the SS and the Gestapo and German police. But by and large, most Jewish POWs, with a few exceptions, they are accorded the same rights as as their Gentile comrades.
So how many times
it was fascinating to learn this because I was writing this book. I said, I've got to deal with religion and POW camps, and I realized, what about Jewish POWs? And I realized there's practically nothing written about their experiences as prisoners of war. The only group that got some written about, there were some exceptions. So a few unfortunate Jewish POWs, but also some Gentile POWs did end up in a concentration camp in Bergen in large numbers, and a few American POWs and some Jewish POWs didn't end up in another concentration camp. But that was the exception, fortunately not the norm.
So how long time did it take to liberate Normandy? And if it had been a failure, what would be the consequence of the war if they failed? Would have failed to invade?
It took. I should have looked up the exact date. It took about 6 weeks it's not until early July is there the breakthrough. It's not until July it took several brutal weeks. But again, after June 6th, there was no chance of the Germans throwing throwing the Allied forces into the ocean. And but the expectation that might be a failure was pretty high. I mean, Eisenhower, much to his credit, he had his resignation speech prepared, his statement prepared, that it was a failure. He was going to resign.
But
And
what would the
blame
consequences of
himself.
the war have been if it had been a failure?
If it had been a failure, um, I suspect, depending on how it failed, and it's always easy to speculate, it's hard to speculate. I suspect it would have been tried again. It's hard to imagine we would not have tried again. Now, it might have made Franklin Roosevelt's reelection in November of 1944 very difficult. Um, it also might have meant the Soviets would have liberated France. It wouldn't have been an impossible task. It would have made the Soviet war effort a lot more difficult. Um, but I think failure was considered a possibility, and Ike was, and I always admire Ike's willingness to, his expectation. I take responsibility. He was not going to blame it on others.
So let's talk about the rest of the liberation process. And I want to bring up a group that I think it's my understanding that has not been very well credited. That is the communist partisans in France that have been resisting Nazis.
That's what I think is one of the reasons how the resistance is remembered. The communists are until the Non-Aggression Pact of August 1939, the communists were on the right side of history in this case, opposing the Nazis, and they had the right idea that they didn't really like capitalists or even socialists, but they even talked about a common front, the Popular Front. And then Stalin decides to cut this deal with the Germans, and it's almost comic because in the United States, the American Communist Party goes from supporting the common front, Popular Front, we got to unite against the Nazi threat, a fascist threat, to we don't want to enter this war. It's a war among capitalists, and we need to stay out. And then after June 22nd, 1941, the communists once again become the most avid opponents of fascism again. I published in my World War II series letters of an American communist. I mean, he was a communist. He fought in the Spanish Civil War in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. I mean, he can't wait to join the American army in World War II and kill Nazis. I mean, you read his letters and he's incredibly ideologically motivated to kill Nazis. He's desperate. He lands on D-Day. He manages basically to get himself to self-assign temporarily to a unit because he wants to land on D-Day. And he finally says to the colonel, under fire, he said, "So now can I get my transfer to your unit?" And he says, the colonel says to him, "Why don't we wait for the pencils to arrive, for the landing?" But yeah, in after June of 1941, among the most important and largest group of resistance in France were communists, members of the communist and Communist Party members. And that's one of the problems with the resistance. I mean, one of the struggles de Gaulle has is he wants to unite the resistance movement behind him, and that's a very difficult feat and gets very complicated. And I'm not an expert on the resistance. I will also say I did tour Normandy in 2000, and then I went back more recently in 2019. And in 2000, I was part of a group that got to interview a member of the resistance, and it was haunting, the stories he told. I mean, how they operated and when they were successful and when they were a failure, and it was really, it's a dangerous thing to do. I mean, he told one case of where a whole resistance cell, got killed because they got soft. They didn't kill an informant, and then he turned them all in, and they all got killed, and that was really haunting to listen to.
So I want to talk a little bit about the goal as well, because how anxious were he that this D-Day would be successful in the liberation France? He must have been very anxious for this operation to be successful.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are opposing there are hardcore Vichy supporters in France who see the future as Germany, and then there are those who want to they will go with the winds and will just endure what they have to do. But for a lot of Frenchmen, they were eager for liberation. And the support for the resistance really grows as it's more clear the Allies will win. That those on the fences do, you know, you have to, you know, one of the reasons not to be overly critical of what people do under occupation is most people want to live. And you need to sort of pick your battles. And to join the resistance in 1940 after the fall of France, the chances of success are not very great. I can see why many Frenchmen, while they might not support the Nazis, are not going to actively resist because the chances of surviving and having any impact are very low. But it's not surprising that Parisians are, you know, as Allied forces were approaching the city, decided let's throw off the Germans without them. You know, even before the Allied forces arrive.
So it's my understanding when as far further inland in France, the Allied get it's more in the street cities, especially there is very intimate street fighting, in street to street fighting.
I should say once the Allies have their breakthrough and they break out in Normandy, at least for the first several weeks, you know, there's even some optimism this war will be over by Christmas. That's even because German forces do collapse after the breakthrough but there will be some significant, there'll be definitely some significant street fighting in the later battles for later battles for, you know, particularly one of the worst in terms of early battles for street fighting was the battle for Aachen, the first German city that is attacked by Allied forces. That becomes quite a slugfest and lots of street fighting and requires different sort of tactics.
Arnhem was kind of similar as well. It was very street to street fighting, right? And when they liberate Arnhem as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, but I think the thing, I know less about Arnhem. Well, yes, there is. One of the things I should say about street fighting, it's often going building by building, and one of the things I learned. I mean, this one historian's talked about how the American Army learned lessons, and one of the things I was always intrigued by is one of the things you got into a building and you blow up walls to get at German defenders rather than approach them directly, blow up the wall next to them, and then surprise them. And I thought, oh, that's a good lesson to learn. You know, my chances of being in combat keep going down every year now that I'm 64. So and I think one of the things that I think historians debate is why did the German army win or why did the German army lose? And for a number of years, the German army politically Americans would make this point. It was almost why the Confederates lost in the Civil War. They were overwhelmed. They won. The Germans lost because of superior numbers. And one of us has to be careful with that argument because at least the Western Allies do not have overwhelming strength against the German army. It's much German. They do eventually get more troops on the continent than the German army, but not by a lot. We fight with we put too many forces in the Air Force and the support troops. And so we decide to fight World War II with only 90 combat divisions, which means by July of 1945, we basically have no reserve divisions except for the airborne division. We have committed every unit we have, every combat division is committed, which means one of the things it means is that it's very hard for the American Army to take a unit out of battle. So instead of taking units out of battles and then giving them replacements, we send replacements on piecemeal basis into units. And the British and German army have a system where they take units out of battle and then replace them. And there's something of a rotation of units, but we fight with a very lean, and so we don't defeat them with overwhelming numbers. And I think the American army does become very adept. They learn a lot of good lessons. I mean, it's an army that can learn, and gets quite effective. A lot of leaders and a lot of units become very effective, particularly by 45, late 44, 45.
How long time does it take for the Western Army, Allied Army, to enter Paris? And when does the goal come back to make his famous speech, "Paris liberated."
Yeah, I
After the
actually,
liberation.
I should have had I don't remember the exact date, but it is in that glorious summer. It's, um, but you know, by September, we're hopeful. Paris has been liberated by what is a holiday in America, Labor Day. The thinking is we might be able to end this war by Christmas, and so it was a really glorious August. Um, Late July and August for Allied forces as much of France is liberated. Um, um,
And what is French attitudes to the Allies coming in with the tanks and weapons and soldiers coming into Paris and the rest of France, liberating them from the Germans?
yeah, I know less about American French attitudes. I mean, I think French attitudes were mixed. There was some, I mean, the toll of the Normandy campaign on civilians in Normandy. There was a lot of melancholy, sometimes anger, sometimes gratitude, but at the cost it came. I mean, it's interesting to go to Normandy today, because you'll just see an abundance of Canadian, British, and American flags. And I think there's genuine appreciation tied into this is a very important part of the tourism economy. Um, but there was anger. I mean, there was not every French. I mean, not every Frenchman or French woman appreciated or the collateral damage from liberation was exceedingly high, and there is some angst and resentment about that. Um, there is a portion of France that's French that's sided with the Germans, so that number shrinks dramatically. Um, um, I think there's a lot of resentment, particularly towards American liberators, um, because of I love the American GI. I got to know I interviewed a lot of veterans, and there's a lot of qualities that were really great. But a lot of them engaged in petty thievery, sexual violence, even against French women, um, and could be quite boorish and not appreciation of what the French sacrificed in the war and what it was like to be occupied. In turn, there's a lot of animosity towards the French. A lot of GIs didn't particularly like the French people. They didn't think they were very appreciative. They didn't think the French were doing their share in the war. Um, so it's an interesting. There's a lot of tension there. Um, 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 a lot of French were glad to be liberated, but also very, very ambivalent about the whole process. And to be a defeat, I think the burden of being a defeated nation, particularly on the part of France, because France had surrendered. I think other occupied countries could say, we did not surrender. I mean, the Norwegians could be very proud. Their king went into exile. Their government went into exile. A lot of Norwegians considered, fought bravely, whereas France, it was a traitor, de Gaulle, that continued the struggle. He was considered by Vichy a traitor.
I want to talk a little bit, and I want to quote this speech and try to quote this speech in full that de Gaulle made when he enters Paris on his first speech. And I don't remember where he made it, but that speech of just Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated, liberated by itself, liberated by its people, with the help of the French armies, with the support and help of all of France, of the France that fight, of the only France, the real France, of the eternal France. And let's talk a little bit what they actually meant by this speech, and as we
Yeah,
thought about in the
it's such
beginning.
an interesting thing because there would be no liberation of France without the Allies, without the Western, without the United States, Canada, and Britain. But on the other hand, he wants to rehabilitate France. He wants France to emerge as a great power. And there's some real. I mean, France still has a large empire. While its navy has been devastated.
They actually were allowed to maintain the empire under
Well, yeah,
German occupation.
there's no rush to apply the Atlantic Charter to empire. They're actually they're grudgingly made part of the Big Five. I mean, they're given an occupation zone in Germany. It's a small one. They are given an occupation zone in Berlin. They're given a seat, on the Security Council, which they still hold. But I think de Gaulle is really saying he very much wants to claim liberation as a French project, and ignoring reality. I mean, it's almost like the fake news of his era, and he's fortunate that the American and British, the SHAEF allows him to do this, to allow French troops to. One should give credit to the resistance figures, the uprising in Paris. I mean, there is an uprising. It is one of the reasons why Paris is not, survives. It's not ruined.
And if I may, it gives very little credit in that speech and in the future to the French partisans and especially communist partisans as well.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to acknowledge them.
Yeah, no, I mean, France, de Gaulle, during the Cold War, it was very awkward for Americans to acknowledge. It still is, even because the legacy of the Cold War, how important the Soviet role was in the war. And, I really, historically, it doesn't get much more despicable than the Stalin, although, what's so tragic about World War II is, I mean, Stalin's awful, but Hitler's even worse. I mean, which says a lot. And so I think, we don't want to credit, Americans don't like to credit the Soviet role. We like to think we overstate our important role our troops played. And same thing with de Gaulle and the French resist. Not only does he want to credit the Allies, but also not recognize the role of the Communist Party in resisting occupation.
Now, and of course, very few troops actually knew French or knew what the was, but it must be translation of speech to the English. So what were the troops' reaction to speech when it doesn't acknowledge their help in the effort?
Well, as I said, I think American troops who fought in Europe were pretty well informed because of both. A huge majority of American troops. It's interesting. I should go back and look at Stars and Stripes, how it reported this speech, because it was likely reported in Stars and Stripes. I'd be curious if they quoted him at length. But likely, the American GI was pretty well informed in Europe. The Stars and Stripes is a daily edited by enlisted men, and it had a pretty free. It had relatively few restrictions. It was not an official organ of the military. It really was a GI edited newspaper. Drove Patton and Omar Bradley crazy, particularly the Bill Malden cartoon. So they would have likely known about it. As I said, there's a lot of criticism of the French support for the war effort. American GIs, when they grumbled about the British, and grumbled a little bit about the Soviets, but they had a lot more grumbling about the French and French support for the war effort.
No, I think we're going to round it up there because, of course, what happened in Paris after the liberation is a whole other episode and another topics to discuss. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you.
No, it's a real pleasure.
And before you go, do you have any, where can people buy your book if they want to read about GI and religion? Or do you have any other books on social media where people might find you if they have any questions they want to ask about?
Yeah, I recently did a book on reporting World War II. And there was a really in terms of dealing with Scandinavia, there was a fascinating article about the Finnish War, and an American reporter. It was written by a Finnish scholar. So I recently had a reader on World War II on journalism. It was a failed conference. It was a conference that was supposed to take place in April of 2020 aboard the Intrepid Museum in New York Harbor, and COVID came to haunt. Led to its cancellation, but it led to a set of articles, really good articles. And I recently published the Oxford Companion, Oxford Handbook on World War II, which covers the whole. Well, there's some parts I would have loved to cover more, but it does try to cover the global history of the war. One of the things, I edited a World War II series with Fordham University Press, and one of the things, my mission as a historian in the United States is to make sure Americans remember World War II was a global war, and not forget particularly the contributions of other allied countries. And so that's one of my mantras. And I think World War II, I teach mainly about the United States, but it is a defining moment for for world affairs. It, for example, speeds decolonization. That's one of the more positive legacies, but it also leads to a bipolar war with the rise of the Soviet Union and the United States. In terms of technology, imagine a modern world without radar or computers. These are both things that come out of World War II. So, and I said, particularly since I think many of your listeners are in Europe, I really would try to visit toward the Normandy Peninsula. It's the history is fascinating. Make sure you see the Bayeux Tapestry, though. I was annoyed at the second tour group is they didn't take everyone to the Bayeux Tapestry. And I think if you're, it was an optional part of the tour. The second time I went, and I'd seen it already, but I told everyone, you got to go see that. Go pay the extra $1 to go see the extra, the extra euro. But there's some really good books out on D-Day, and I really recommend, for example, one of my mentors is a historian, the late Stephen Ambrose. His book, particularly Band of Brothers and D-Day, are quite good. But there's also a really rich literature on D-Day that's well worth reading. And
thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great pleasure to have you. This has been Without H12. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are an Apple Podcast, consider writing a review. That would help us a lot. If you are on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars. You can also give us 1, though 5 would be preferable. And if you like this episode, check out some other episodes we have. Be sure you're going to find something you like. And we'll, of course, cover the other topics on World War II as well, such as Operation Barbarossa and the Soviet invasion of Berlin, to mention a few, and we have more to come, I'm sure, in the future. This has been That H12. My name is Alan, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.